Welcome to our module on tribalism. Let's get started. So tribalism is our megatrend that's all about the sense of belonging that consumers seek out, whether that be organized around a specific belief or even a specific brand. The driver here is one of connection, and sadly that's something that a lot of consumers are missing today. You see, it's never been easier to get in touch with one another, and yet we've never felt more alone. This is very closely tied to loneliness, which we hear a lot about today. People have described the loneliness crisis as a human catastrophe, an epidemic, and even a public health crisis, believe it or not. One thing to get clear on about loneliness is that it's not caused by a lack of social interaction specifically, but rather it's caused by a lack of meaningful interaction. Ambiguous loss is sort of a piece of the loneliness puzzle as we know it today, and it's this phenomenon coined by Pauline Boss that's described as what you feel when somebody is physically present with you, but psychologically gone. It used to be really useful in describing situations like where somebody had a spouse that had Alzheimer's, but increasingly it's being used in situations where your peers or your spouse is too busy on their phone or otherwise to pay attention to you. So beyond ambiguous loss, 1 out of 5 people say that they rarely or never feel close to others these days. There's a 26% risk of premature mortality associated with loneliness, hence the title of public health crisis. It's being taken so seriously that a team of researchers are actually coming together to create a pill to specifically treat symptoms of loneliness. Now, loneliness has been tackled in very explicit ways by brands and by other organizations, as we see in this Insight Anti-Loneliness. But loneliness and its, supposed cures are creeping into our world in more subtle ways as well. And one of the almost accidental outcomes of this is the nichification of content. This refers to the fact that much of the content that we intake today is very specifically curated towards our individual interests. And in no world of media is this more true than the world of podcasts. A lot of that is due to the fact that much of the podcast content that we are exposed to is actually user-generated, making it a highly democratized world of media. Nowadays, though, it's so big that we also see big players like big brands coming into the space as well. Now, to date, there are more than 29 million podcasts published, and podcast listeners are actually quite an engaged group. They spend an average of more than 6 hours listening per week. The world of podcasts, like I said, has gotten very specific, and it includes offshoots like Who Weekly, a podcast about celebrities you've never heard of, The Pen Addict for stationery enthusiasts, Chameleon Breeder podcast for people who breed chameleons, and even a meta podcast about podcasts. These groups form these allegiant groups often on Facebook, and it even leads to the demand for things like merchandise so people can show off their love of a very specific podcast, like the one we see here on Who Weekly. It's even led to the popularity of things like podcast clubs, which are like book clubs, but for podcast episodes. Taking things into the real life world, we've actually seen a 2,000% uptick in podcast events since 2013. So this is a huge area of growth, and these people want to come together to bond about their common interests in person. This is all to say that the intersection between personal interests and human connection is incredibly powerful, but it doesn't have to take place through a podcast live event. Another way that we see this happening and being taken care of is through the phenomenon known as collective effervescence. Collective effervescence is a term coined by Emil Durkheim, and it refers to the specific feeling that you get when you experience something at the same time as many other people. Collective effervescence adds color and meaning to almost every group activity that we do. This includes things like going to sporting events, religious ceremonies, going to concerts, and even protests and demonstrations. So as a brand, you can actually offer up this experience too. In fact, we've seen brands do this for a number of years with experiences like flash mobs. The idea here is that you're bringing people together to do something at the same time to help them feel connected to one another. So use that as your guidepost. When it comes to creating the future of tribalism, remember that meaning is more important than flash. And secondly, make sure that you are fostering and supporting specific passions. Thirdly, don't just bring people together, do so with a lot of purpose. This wraps up our module on tribalism. Here's a question for you to consider when it comes to making tribalism work for you and your brand. What can your brand do to help consumers feel more connected?